Last year, the world was shocked with Russia's attack on Ukraine, and the impact of the war in Ukraine continues to evolve. To provide some insight on the topic, we have with us today Professor Michael Kimmage. He is a professor of history at the Catholic University of America and a senior non-resident fellow at Center for Strategic and International Studies. Professor Kimmage specializes in the history of the Cold War, in 20th century U.S. diplomatic and intellectual history, and in U.S.-Russian relations since 1991. From 2014 to 2016, he served on the Secretary's policy planning staff at the U.S. Department of State, where he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. Professor Kimmage has published 3 books to date, and his next book is due out March 2024. It's called Collision: The War in Ukraine and the Origins of the New Global Instability. Professor Kimmage has written articles and book reviews for the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, Politico, Foreign Affairs, The New Republic, and the Frankfurter Allgemeine. Maybe I'll let you say this one. He's been visiting professor at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich and the Vilnius University in Lithuania. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kimmage.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation to appear before this group. Now, on balance, I wouldn't recommend paying too much attention to predictions made by historians. It's not that we don't like to make predictions, but that we don't tend to be very good at it, perhaps because we focus more on the past. But still, I'm going to, with that grain of salt, engage in one prediction that I feel quite confident in making this morning, and then I will try to support that prediction with 3 points or 3 reasons why I think it's the case. And the prediction is, as the title of this address would suggest, that the war in Ukraine will be a long war. It's not a prediction about how it will end, who will win, what the world will look like at the end of the war, simply that the war itself will be long. And I'd now like to try to support that prediction with 3 reasons, and let me just outline them in professorial fashion. Let me just outline them right now, and then I'll flesh each of them out in just a moment. The first concerns a military asymmetry between Ukraine and Russia, Ukraine being more motivated and Russia being larger and perhaps in some technical aspects stronger than Ukraine. The second concerns the region in which Ukraine finds itself, which has been a war zone, unfortunately, for centuries, and I think that matters for how we anticipate and think about the future. And then thirdly, I'd like to make a few remarks about leadership and why leadership will make for a long war, and we'll make a few points about Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and a few points about Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. So starting with the first point about military asymmetry, I think it is objectively the case that the motivation on the side of Ukraine has been dramatically greater than the motivation, especially of Russian soldiers. Putin strikes me as motivated, but the people he commands have been quite a bit less so. I don't think Russian soldiers still know what they're fighting for. I think a lot of them don't believe in the cause to the extent that they understand it. And I don't think that Putin has succeeded in Russia in saying that Russia is under some great threat from Ukraine or from Ukraine's supporters. This is a war of choice for Russia, and that means something, I think, very particular for the soldiers who are fighting it. They're not defending their homeland. With only a few exceptions, the war has all been on the soil and the territory of Ukraine. They are fighting for something. It's still hard to say what that something is in Ukraine. And so you've seen consistently throughout the war over the last 15, 16 months, big problems of morale on the Russian side. And that has really fouled up the Russian war effort. By contrast, Ukraine is, for all the obvious reasons, exceptionally motivated. They are defending their homeland, they're defending their capital city, and the nature of the Russian occupation, Russia occupies roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory. Some of that is from before 2022, some of it after 2022. But the nature of the Russian occupation, as I think all of us know, has been really quite brutal. And that brutality has, in addition to the defense of the homeland, spurred Ukrainians to fight. And so on one level, you've got a dramatic contrast between the motivation of Ukraine, which is high, and the motivation of Russia, which is moderate and in some cases low. If that were the only story, then you could predict a short war that Ukraine would win, but the asymmetry is that Russia is a much larger country with a bigger economy, and of course it's also a nuclear power. Ukraine is roughly 40 million people, Russia 140 million people. Russian economy is quite a lot larger. It has succeeded in sort of surviving some of the difficulties of the war. There's still a lot of sale of gas and oil on the part of Russia, and Russia is able to purchase ammunition and arms from countries like Iran and elsewhere. That hasn't been easy for Russia, but it has resources in this war that are not comparable to the resources of Ukraine. To a degree, Ukraine is catching up because of Western assistance, but you can't really compare the two powers. In military terms, on paper, Russia still has assets that Ukraine doesn't have. So that, I think, is my first reason for why this is going to be a long war. You've got higher motivation on one side, and you've got a higher degree of resources on the other side. These don't exactly cancel each other out, but I think it points in the direction of a long war. So that's my first point. Second point is more in my guise as a historian, and if you look at this region, you could say Ukraine, Belarus, surrounding countries, it has been a war zone for centuries. Let's just limit ourselves to the 20th century. We tend to think of the First World War in the United States as a question of the Western Front, but there's a very sizable Eastern Front in the First World War, and that really is the territory of Ukraine and Belarus. It's at the center of the story of the First World War. Even more so, when we think of Hitler using the phrase Lebensraum, what Hitler has in mind really is the territory of Ukraine. That was his cardinal motivation in some respects for starting the Second World War, was to gain access to Ukrainian territory and to make it the breadbasket of Germany rather than the breadbasket of Ukraine or the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. There's a sort of hiatus during the Cold War because everything is under Soviet control, and then things open up after 1991, and it should be unsurprising to us. It's depressing, but it should be unsurprising that there is a battle royal going on right now over who's to control what in Eastern and Central Europe. That's the story of this region historically, and it's not unusual what's happening now. In a way, it's the typical or traditional story. Let me just make one further point in terms of the region as to why I think conflict is going to last a long time in this region. Ukraine is a strategically very important country. I don't think many of us realized, even those of us who spent a lot of time studying Ukraine before 2014 or 2022, exactly how strategic it is. Ukraine is strategically important for China. It falls, sort of squarely, not quite in the middle, but squarely in the center of the Belt and Road Initiative, which extends, of course, to the Eastern Mediterranean, to the Balkans, and into the Middle East. And Ukraine is right there. I think it's no surprise to say that Ukraine is unbelievably strategically important for Russia. Maybe Putin makes it more important than it should be, but he puts Ukraine at the top of the agenda for Russia in terms of Russian security. Ukraine is extremely strategically important for Europe. Where does the European Union end? Where does NATO end? That's a question that's going to be determined in the country of Ukraine, and Ukraine is strategically very important for the United States precisely because it's strategically important for Europe. The U.S. is the major guarantor of security in Europe, and so Ukraine is of pivotal importance. It's why the U.S. has been, in the scheme of things, the biggest military supporter of Ukraine of any country in the world, because it assesses Ukraine to be so strategically important. But the kicker is that Ukraine is very strategically important, but so far no one country is big enough or strong enough to dominate the story and to kind of win the outcomes. And so you have a contest over Ukraine fought now, in a way, primarily between Russia and the United States, and neither country can get all of what it wants. And I think that's going to be the case for quite a while to come. Frustrating from a U.S. point of view, but that's sort of where we are. And now, by way of conclusion, a third point about leadership and why leadership will make for a long war. Let me start on the Ukrainian side and then say a few words about Putin and then draw things to a close with a sort of prediction within a prediction about how to look at the war and how to understand the war. We all, I think, know the story of the first 2 weeks of the war. It's become almost mythology at this point, where the Russians sent in paratroopers and special forces to kidnap and perhaps to execute Volodymyr Zelensky, to imprison the government, to take over the country through a kind of war coup d'etat combination. And not only did that not come to pass in a practical sense for the Russians, but Zelensky, who could have fled the country, the U.S. offered him, protection and safe harbor outside of Ukraine. Zelensky stayed in the country and displayed, I think, all of the courage and the virtues for which he's now globally familiar. That's not changed in the case of Zelensky, and I would even argue that if Zelensky were to be removed from leadership for whatever reason, I don't think that the course of politics would change much in Ukraine. I think that they could find other leaders, maybe not quite with the charisma and communication skills of Zelensky, but they could find other leaders to carry the torch. Zelensky has made it exceptionally clear that his ambitions in the war are the full return of sovereignty and independence to Ukraine, which is to say the expulsion of Russian soldiers from eastern Ukraine and from Crimea. Zelensky is not in the least bit ambiguous about that, and he has the backing and the support, hard to measure exactly, let's say 80, 90, 95% of the Ukrainian population. Doesn't mean that he's going to get all of those things back, but that's what he's articulated, that's what he's driving for, and I think it would be fair to say that he has demonstrated extraordinary leadership skills, at the very least in articulating this goal for Ukraine and in gathering global support for Ukraine from the US, from the Europeans, and from others. I think he has been a case study in leadership. It's not an original observation of mine. I think it's pretty widely shared, but let me just emphasize the point. Now, we could turn our attention to Russia and say, look, by contrast, all of the ways in which Putin is sort of second class or inferior to Zelensky. I mean, he's an autocrat. He's quite aloof and distant from his population. He's waged what, in my opinion, is a criminal war against Ukraine. I think it's a strategic blunder for Russia. We can make all of those points, but if you just focus on the issue of leadership in Russian terms, Putin is very much in the saddle. And what Putin got right with the war, lots of things he got wrong, but what Putin got right with the war is that the war would be popular in Russia. And it has been, to my surprise, much more popular than I would have expected it to be. Putin also commands a very significant infrastructure of repression. So you now, if you cross his path in any way in Russia, you'll probably end up in prison or with some kind of difficulty. And there's no sign of that changing. And just as Zelensky has articulated the goal of complete sovereignty and independence for Ukraine, Putin's goal is also not ambiguous for Ukraine. At the very least, he wants to divide it in two. He wants to partition the country and create a kind of Russian colony or a part of Russia. He's annexed territory in theory already to Russia, or perhaps he wants the whole thing. And if not that, then he's going to wreck the country as much as possible so that the West, Europe, and the United States can't have it. He's got very big ambitions when it comes to Ukraine, rather dark and sinister ambitions, but very big ambitions. And I see no signs of him swerving, changing, rethinking the war, nor is he being forced to by the system within Russia. So it's almost like a mathematical equation. If we would take variable A as Zelensky and variable B as Putin, you put A plus B, I think it equals C, which is a very long war, because you have two leaders who are very much in control, who do have the support of their populations, who are not just isolated figures, and both of them are driving for aims in Ukraine that are completely incompatible, which of course is why you have the war itself. And so that's the third point that I would make, but I want to offer a prediction within a prediction by way of my absolute conclusion. I think that there is more probability of change on the Russian side of the equation than on the Ukrainian side. I think for Ukrainians to give up their country and to yield to partitionment or to being made into a colony is so impossible, so difficult, that they are going to keep fighting however long they can, however they can. I think on the Russian side, it's a different story. As I mentioned earlier, this is a war of choice, and I think there's a lot of reservation and anxiety within the Russian leading elite, not that you can voice it at the moment with Putin in charge, but there's a lot of anxiety about where Russia is going. So if you had to bet on one of these two countries changing gears politically, I would bet on Russia changing gears. And so I would say eyes on Russia for the future. That's the variable in this war that can change. I won't predict change. I'll just say that it's possible, and that's the thing that we should be paying attention to, because if it did, then instead of a very long war, what we might get is a war of medium length, or even a war that wraps up sooner than I predicted it wrapping up at the beginning of this presentation. So I will close on that note and very much welcome your questions and thoughts at the present moment. Thank you so much for the question about blips in the relationship and the sort of new terrain that we're on. I couldn't agree more. This is indeed new terrain. I am a historian of the Cold War. It's what I spend most of my time doing, sort of researching and writing the Cold War and teaching it mostly to undergraduate students. And I am struck by how different what the conflict is now, how different it is from the Cold War. And without wishing to be alarmist or melodramatic, I'm going to argue that where we are now is worse than we were during the Cold War. Now, the first 8 years of the Cold War, 1945 to 1953, when Stalin is still alive, are pretty terrifying. You know, Stalin was Stalin. It's the beginning of the nuclear age. You know, you had the duck and cover stuff in American schools, and it wasn't a picnic by any means. And then you have the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, and then the early 80s is another period of real tension. But I think what's different about the present moment, and I don't say this out of criticism of our government, I don't think it can be otherwise, but it's scary, is that there's no contact between the two governments, between the Russian and the US government. There's a little bit of back channel stuff, but there's no real diplomacy going on between the two governments, and that's different from the Cold War. The Cold War, you had proxy wars, you have Vietnam, you have Afghanistan, you have lots of proxy wars in Latin America, in the Middle East, Africa, and elsewhere, but you did have sustained dialogue between the world's two major nuclear powers, and that dialogue is gone. So I don't know how we get it back. I don't think it's probably possible in the short term with Putin, but we do have to acknowledge, either as US citizens or just as citizens of the world, we do have to acknowledge how dangerous this state of affairs is. And then one additional point, I can't think of a war during the Cold War where Moscow and Washington were quite as toe-to-toe as they are at the present moment. There was always a degree of distance. So the US, when it came to Afghanistan, it supported the anti-Soviet forces, but it did so with a certain amount of subterfuge. Same was true on the Soviet side when they supported the North Vietnamese and others against US interests. Now there's no subterfuge. US is in the middle of the war in some ways in Ukraine. Obviously, Russia is waging war in Ukraine, and you've got very, very close proximity. And that, too, is a novelty for these two nuclear powers. So far, they've actually navigated that well. We've not seen any incidents over the last 15, 16 months of an American soldier and a Russian soldier sort of running into each other. But we're not that far away from an accident that could push things in that direction. So there, too, I think we have to acknowledge, unfortunately, the risks of the current situation. They are risks that are, in some ways, deeper, sharper, more unpredictable than the Cold War risks. Thank you so much for the question. I think that there are always opportunities in a situation like this, and a few of them have been taken already over the course of the last year and a half. I'll just speak for the U.S. I mean, I'm sure for other countries there are other ways of looking at it, but since we are in Washington, that's the angle that I'll choose. So one opportunity that's been taken, I think successfully by the Biden administration, has been to tighten the transatlantic relationship. And at the same time that we've never seen such a degree of conflict between Moscow and Washington, I'm not sure if we've ever seen quite the same degree of cooperation between Europe and the United States. If you go into the deep history of the Second World War, not the sort of glorified version of it, you'll see that there was a lot of friction between Eisenhower and Montgomery, between Churchill and de Gaulle, between even FDR and Churchill. I think there's been less of that in the current conflict, and so the degree of cooperation on the part of the coalition supporting Ukraine has been rather extraordinary. It's also significant that Finland has already joined the NATO alliance as a result of the war, and it looks like Sweden will be joining Finland shortly. So there is a way in which, from a U.S. perspective, the alliance structure is strengthening. I'll make one point, though, that's a little bit less celebratory because I think it's an opportunity still to be grasped, and this is a very inadequate term, as everybody knows, but nobody can find a better one, and this is the so-called Global South, where at the beginning of the conflict, the U.S. expected countries like India, Brazil, South Africa to sort of fall in line behind the United States and to really support Ukraine, and that hasn't happened. I think the Biden administration has really struggled to make its case, its interpretation of the war, credible and persuasive to a lot of countries that are fellow democracies, that are not necessarily on Russia's side, but sort of haven't really agreed with the U.S. Arguments and claims about the war. And so there I think the Biden administration has its work cut out for it. It has to do a much better job articulating or listening to what other countries have to say about this conflict and coming up with a sort of more global set of partners on behalf of Ukraine. I think that is in the long term a kind of opportunity, or it should be looked at as an opportunity, but the U.S. has a great deal of work to do in that regard. It keeps referring to like-minded countries, and the like-minded countries are fine. Countries that are a little bit less like-minded, that's where the work needs to be done.
Does this? Oh, great. Professor Kimmage, thank you so much for your comments this morning. You mentioned that when you were speaking that the US is the major guarantor of security in Europe, and as a European, I'm very grateful for that. But it's often represented as being an altruistic act. But would you care to comment on the position that, you know, if you're going to be a major megapower, as the US is, and you're going to be fighting wars and conflicts, be they hot, cold, or proxy, or anything in between, that it's better to have your front lines somewhere east of Poland and, you know, for Southeast Asia, somewhere around Taiwan, than actually in Boston or Hawaii, for example. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. I agree that if we're too sentimental about the transatlantic relationship and if we see it as altruism, we're not going to really get that relationship right, either as the Biden administration sees it or as we should interpret it from the outside. So I'll just give you my best version of it in terms of what the interests are that drive this relationship, and they start in 20th century history, that the U.S. fights two wars or is involved in two world wars that break out in Europe, First World War and the Second World War. And so the U.S. comes to the conclusion in the 1940s that it just has to be more involved, and that leads to the Marshall Plan and the NATO alliance and a very, very strong security commitment to Europe. So first and foremost, what the U.S. doesn't want is a major, sort of metastasizing, spreading military conflict in Europe, because that could demand huge commitments on the part of the United States, and it's also very, very bad for the U.S. economy. U.S. is a major investor, trading partner. It's a major place of investment for the United States, and the more military tension and problems you have in Europe, the worse it is for the United States. So that's, I think, a very important category of just raw interest on the part of the U.S. that makes Ukraine important, that makes Poland important, and that makes, of course, the Russia challenge or the Russian threat important as well. But since you mentioned Taiwan, there's sort of another piece of the puzzle for the U.S., which is that, and I think that every country kind of looks at Ukraine this way at the moment, China, Russia, the U.S., that a precedent is going to be set in Ukraine. We don't quite know what that precedent is going to be. If Russia runs the tables and conquers the country, that would be very bad for the United States, because I think it would be a kind of invitation to other powers, whether China or other countries, to do similar or to engage in similar such adventures. But if Russia fails in Ukraine, that's a precedent that for the U.S. is quite useful. It sort of means that this kind of military adventurism is not going to be the wave of the future, perhaps. So I think that that's an interest of the U.S. as well, to make sure that might makes right is not the rule that comes out of Ukraine, but something that's different. Biden administration would use the phrase liberal international order. We could spend a lot of time thinking about that phrase, but I think the better way of looking at it is just about precedent setting. And so it's a definite U.S. interest to set a precedent of non-imperialism sort of non-adventurism in Ukraine, and that's one of the reasons why the stakes are so high for the U.S. in this conflict, even though it's extremely far from the United States, and formally speaking, Ukraine is not an ally of the U.S., but it still matters greatly.
I understand all the issues about U.S. interest and even the question from my colleague about the lack of altruism. But I think for the person on the street here in the U.S., we have more trouble understanding, though, why this is not, why we, or the Biden administration, has to go to great lengths and has this obligation to convince the Europeans that this is in their interest. Because the average person would think, they're in your backyard. We have seen what happens with Soviet aggression in the past in Europe, and we assumed when there was the invasion in Ukraine after Crimea that there would be immediate alarm across Europe as the Russia encroached upon these, and what's next, and is Poland safe, and the like. And yet we haven't seen that. And I think that you see this reluctance, and maybe on the heels of the Trump administration talking about Europe pulling their weight and the like, we see here they are in the back, on the front lines of Europe, which the countries are so much closer together. It's one of the things that Americans don't really understand, how close those borders are. And yet we're talking about the Biden administration having a large lift to convince Europe that this is also in their interest. So I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, no, this is a great question, and I think this question is going to inform the presidential election, the sort of campaign season of 2024, where there's going to be a big argument about exactly this. So it's a really important one to ask, because I think it will shape American politics, or is shaping American politics. So 3 quick points in response to your question. I think it's crazy in some ways that you have a Europe that's as affluent as it is, that's not able to defend itself. I don't mean that impolitely to the Europeans in the audience, but it's just sort of the fact of the matter. Europe really tried in 2014 to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, France, and Germany. It didn't come to pass, and there's just something outrageous about that absent capacity in Europe, and that's sort of point number 1. Point number 2, if I were a European diplomat appearing before you, I could have a long list of all the things that Europeans are doing in this conflict, that they are in aggregate giving more money than the U.S. is. Certainly with refugees, that's been much more a European commitment than it has been a U.S. commitment. And Europe is divided. You have very, very forward-leaning countries in the east and the center, and then you have the more reluctant countries in the west and in the south. But Europe is, in the scheme of things, doing a lot. But thirdly, and I think this is maybe a good place on which to conclude, the United States is a unique superpower, and this sometimes is forgotten. There's this rhetoric of American decline, and you sort of hear that pretty often. I'm not quite sure what it means. I think it's sort of almost more of a literary motif than really an accurate analysis of what the U.S. is. U.S. combines something unique that no other power in the world does. It combines military power, economic power, and what you could describe as convening power. It's a kind of diplomatic power that it's able to get countries together. If you absent that from the equation in Ukraine, I'm sure Ukraine would fight valiantly, and it might sort of do fine against Russia, but I think it would be in dire straits. There's really something that the U.S. contributes to this conflict that's utterly unique. And Europe is just not in the position. It's not unified enough. It doesn't have enough military power. It's not cohesive enough to provide that. So it's a kind of either-or decision. Either the West backs Ukraine, which means that the U.S. backs Ukraine, or it doesn't. And that's sort of where we are. But given that we're in Washington and sort of where the sausage is being made and where the decisions are being made, it's a good place to emphasize just how unique what the U.S. has to offer is, and how consequential it would be if the U.S. commitment would be taken out of the picture.